Photography has been used, since its inception almost 2 centuries ago, most often as a tool for documenting a moment in time. The photograph's unique ability to perfectly visually replicate whatever sits in front of the lens makes it an ideal tool for such a task. However, that capacity for perfect replication ends at the visual. When boiled down to its most essential components, a photograph is a two-dimensional map of the light hitting a flat surface. And a two-dimensional photograph cannot capture or replicate the physical, tangible experience of the scene it depicts. As such, through both my research and my artistic practice, I'm trying to investigate these differences in experience, and most importantly, how these differences affect how someone perceives an image. Phenomenology, a discipline within philosophy, is perhaps an ideal starting point for investigating these differences. Phenomenology is the study of phenomena. Phenomena in this instance mean an object or event, and how we, as conscious beings, experience and interpret them. It is an incredibly broad area of philosophical debate and research that can cover any number of elements within an experience. However, I have tried to keep my own experimentation much more narrowly focused on the visual, spatial and geometric elements of photography. I believe these are the three main factors that make up the experience of a photograph in relation to its subject. These phenomenological differences, I believe, are distinct enough to consider a photograph a completely different and almost completely unrelated entity to the subject it portrays. If you were to unpick the experience of a photograph and separate it into its main sensory components, the first and most obvious would of course be the visual. When stood still looking at a photograph, it is often almost impossible not to have at least a somewhat familiar feeling to looking at the actual subject of the image. However, this illusion is broken the moment you begin to move, clearly showing photographs are, and we believe them to be, in de Geer's famous phrase, an imprint of nature. Peterson poses the idea that photographs are not independent objects, experientially untethered from their subjects, but instead he suggests they are objects whose state is completely reliant on their visual elements. A photograph, by Peterson's notion, acts more as a description of the visual experience of its subject. Dense natural dependence, so I maintain, is what lies behind photographs' capacity to provide epistemic access to their subject matter. A statement that would naturally suggest that the visual stimulus of a photograph is only recognisable because we have had visual interaction with the subject, or at the very least objects that are similar. However, this leaves the altogether bigger question of what happens when you take away this visual similarity. When a photograph is abstracted beyond the point of recognition, what is it? What are the differences between a photograph and its subject? In my own work, I have experimented with abstracting an image of an object to try and find where people stop making the association with the object and begin seeing the image as a unique visual experience. By stripping away recognisable visual elements, things like shadow, colour, texture and shape, one by one, I could see exactly how far this natural dependence could go. Cavan and Taylor named the theorised link Peterson described as the folk psychological account, an occurrence wherein the viewer sees a photograph and infers the subject based on the common factor of visual similarity. My own findings seem to lend a lot of credence to this folk psychological account. As I stripped away more and more of these recognisable elements, removed more of the overlapping experience, and made prominent the unique parts of this phenomenological experience, less and less people recognised the photograph for its subject. Instead, people began to describe the material properties as opposed to the visual. Again, however, the same problem arises. Even while knowing there is a point where recognition of the subject can unravel the perception of a photograph, after that point it just becomes a sculpture. An object of a different kind, but one dependent on the material from which it is made. So while the image shares the visual experience of its subject, we can say that the folk psychological account is something we can reasonably assume occurs. However, to describe the photograph as naturally dependent, as Peterson does, on its subject is not always true. When an image is altered to be less similar to its subject, it becomes close to being a unique, independent experience. As Cavan and Taylor states, an intuitive thought is that seeing an object in a photograph feels more like being in actual face-to-face perceptual contact with that object than just seeing that object in a handmade picture. This statement implies not only that the realism of an image significantly affects how we perceive it, but also that, when I consider it in relation to my visual experiment, there is a sort of scale that indicates that change in perception. After forming this conclusion, I could not help but be intrigued, ensnared, and frankly enraptured by new questions. How do these differences in perception affect the viewer? What does it make them think? How does it make them feel? When talking about the effect of these perceived aberrations, a fantastic point to work from is Walter Benjamin and his The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, wherein he discusses the relationship a viewer has with an artwork and the implications of photography on that relationship. Benjamin discusses the inherent closeness that a photograph brings due to the very same effect that was established earlier, one Peterson described as quasi-illusionistic. Benjamin talks in depth about the aura possessed by an artwork, an inherent quality that all unique works have, one he described as being diminished by the photographic reproduction. The here and now of the original constitute the abstract idea of its genuineness, and there is no mistaking the difference between the reproduction and the picture. These two statements alone would suggest that Benjamin disavows the idea that the photo and its subject share an intrinsic sensory and experiential link. However, there is explicit acknowledgement from Benjamin of the inherent perceptual connection in the statement, stripping the object of its sheath, shattering the aura, bear witness to a kind of perception where a sense of similarity in the world is so highly developed that, through reproduction, it even minds similarity from what only happens once, which again implies the existence and in fact potency of the quasi-illusionistic effect. What I propose is that as these scales of perception, established from my visual experiments, shift from recognisable and thus lacking that unique aura, over to more phenomenologically unique, that aura increases. And the natural emotional response is strengthened in tandem. Not only that, but when an artwork is replicated over and over, it becomes somewhat commodified. So, as an image becomes less and less unique, the viewer becomes less and less engaged. A similar concept has been thoroughly explored in the arts of theatre and film. After all, theatre is perhaps the medium most strongly affected by the diminishing of the aura. The idea of breaking the fourth wall has been a staple of theatre longer than we could even hope to get, and continues to be a commonplace technique right up to the modern day. Bertolt Brecht was one of the first to write about the technique with a significant amount of depth and analysis. As a playwright and stage director himself, Brecht sought to experiment with ways to get his audience to engage with his work more critically. He was almost offended by the idea that his work could be consumed passively. It is widely agreed upon that when an audience watches a stage production, they suspend their disbelief. They automatically ignore the artificial nature of what they are watching. Usually, at least in the West, where a lot of actors follow some variation of Stanislavski's method, performers try to completely embody the characters they portray, in an attempt to hold up this suspension of disbelief. Brecht, however, after a trip to the theatre in China, discovered that many of their plays used a different approach. It was commonplace for actors to, rather than embody their characters' emotions, simply act out an obvious, even slightly exaggerated performance of said emotions. The Chinese performer does not act as if, in addition to the three walls around him, there are also a fourth wall. He makes it clear he knows he is being looked at. Thus the illusions of the European stage is set aside. This blatantly performative style, Brecht said, created a reaction not in the form of emotionlessness, but in the form of emotions which do not have to be identical with those of the presented character. As such, Brecht sought to break the audience's suspension of disbelief. By regularly drawing their attention to the artificiality and non-reality of his productions, by making the imaginary fourth wall that sits between the stage and those consuming it, Brecht forced people to engage with his works and seek out the messages he imbued them with. By breaking the illusion, he created a specific emotional and intellectual response. While photography does not have a fourth wall to break, I want to try and apply my supposititious scale to a similar end, using this pre-established understanding of how to break photography's illusion, to invoke a more critical, in fact even a more cynical, engagement with my work from the viewer. It was a concern of mine, at least before embarking on this project, that such a technique wouldn't be possible in photography. As a medium, it's more static and more instantly consumable than theatre. However, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in the preface to his Phenomenology of Perception, says, such a lengthy statement is best broken down in specific sections and explained within the context of how they affect my work. To start at the beginning, because we are through and through related to the world, the only way for us to catch sight of ourselves is by suspending this movement, by refusing to be complicit with it. A sentence which is essentially a similar sentiment to Brecht's theories about creating greater engagement by making the audience suspend their disbelief. However, Husserl's Unimitzumation, which is mentioned, is meant to be applied much more broadly. It comes from Husserl's 1938 Logical Investigations, and is the technique he claims one must apply to every experience to describe it adequately. like breaking the suspension of disbelief. It involves trying to detach oneself from the experience they hope to analyse. And again, just as the technique is similar to Brecht's, the rationale behind it also follows the same reasoning. Because precisely as the presuppositions of every thought, they are taken for granted, and they pass by unnoticed. In just the same way, it is to intervene against the passive ignorance of a situation, and instead to cause one to be more active, critical, and engaged. While perhaps it can sound as if I have simply described two people making the same point, the difference is the context. Brecht's work and theories were limited to his chosen medium of theatre. However, Merleau-Ponty and Husserl's statements are supposed to be universally applicable, not just in regard to artistic technique. It is this fact that helped to imbue me with more confidence in trying to define and nurture these techniques in the photographic medium. With my own work, I have attempted to usurp people's expectations. I tried to lean into the typical visual language of documentary photograph, like those of Bruce Davidson, Tish Murtha or Bill Brandt. This is with the intention of creating an unassuming setup. Like an unsuspecting audience, walking into a theatre, only to be pounced upon by Brecht's breaking of the fourth wall, the viewer will just expect to see a typical photograph. However, by combining multiple negatives while printing in the darkroom, I have sought to add elements that, despite providing clear epistemic access to the viewer, could not possibly exist. I am far from the first person to do this, and have taken a lot of inspiration from the techniques of pictorialist Henry Peach Robinson and his early developments in composite printing. Surrealist Raoul Ulbach, not only for his incredible imagery, but also the way he imbued his images with his own strong beliefs, as well as the more contemporary Jerry Ullsman, due to his absolutely seamless technique and beautiful compositions. It is my hope that this dissonance between the photorealism of the image and the impossibility of its subject matter marks the first step in asking the viewer to be more analytical. It was intended to be the first method of breaking the photographic illusion, playing with inconsistency in the light and shadow of different negatives, the relative scale of certain sections being far too big or far too small, placing images in a context you would never expect to find them. I chose the imagery that I did because I wanted the mundanity of the backdrop and setting to make the surreal elements even more shocking and bizarre. Following this first step, it is my hope that the audience will begin analysing the image. Particularly, I want them to try and unravel how the image was made. I've drawn a lot of inspiration from photo montage for this work, specifically that of the punks, like Linda Sterling and her blatant imagery and visual metaphor, whose work often bears obvious markers of its construction, such as sharp and messy rips, tears, and edges, so that, as the viewer analyses the image, they begin to notice the poorly hidden seams of its construction. Harsh cuts on the edges of some negatives, clear disparity in contrast, multiple areas having different depth of field. Through this breaking of the photographic convention and subsequent investigation from the viewer, the print has to be engaged with actively. It's my intention to create a situation where, even if the viewer is passively looking at the photograph, the techniques I've used will distance the audience, like with Husserl's Unermittelmachen or Brecht's alienation technique, and then it will draw them right back in. What I hope most of all, however, is that this critical engagement does not stop at the dissecting of the image's construction, but instead investigates deeper into the messaging and meaning behind it. The actual image itself is only part of the equation, however. Just as I put some elements of my negative in an unusual context, the context of how the image is viewed is equally as important. While my work in this particular project is made to be exhibited as a print, and I can expect a higher level of engagement because of that, compared to, say, an image on social media which is consumed before the viewer immediately moves on to the next one, it is still placed in a context where it is surrounded by other photographs. A viewer can still just as easily glance at it and then move on to the next one. I toyed with a few ideas of how to present the image to create an immediate engagement. These consist of using ornate framing, hanging at an angle, or hanging a noticeable distance away from the wall. However, all of these ideas seem to push past the point of drawing attention to the image, and instead would work to distract the viewer from the image itself. The opposite of what I want. The method I've decided upon, while in a similar vein to those distracting efforts, feels a lot less obvious and a lot less distracting. By hanging the image slightly higher than the hang height of the others in the exhibition, not so much that it draws attention away from other works, or indeed the image in question, but enough so that when walking past it, someone can sense something is off and feels compelled to investigate. Whether these techniques I've tried to implement will be successful, I don't know, and won't know until the exhibition opens. However, I feel confident in the fact that they are rooted in well-established theories, and my experiments have provided me with positive results. What is unfortunate, however, is the fact that I have not yet been able to explore these ideas of phenomenology, interpretation, and perceptual contact in the depth that I believe they both deserve and require. It's an area that I'll have no choice but to continue researching and experimenting with in my later work. While I feel that I have only scratched the surface of this vast and seemingly insurmountable mountain of ideas, I know that I have learned too much and have become far too curious and invested to simply stop climbing now.